Okay, hello everybody. My name is Pat Jennings. I'm with the Murrieta Valley Historical Society. Today we're recording a presentation I did last week, but unfortunately I was defeated by technology, so we couldn't live stream nor could we record it. So I'm redoing it again. A little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Murrieta. Though I don't come from a farming family, I did spend some time on my uncle's ranch, so I know the pleasure of bucking hay and shoveling grain, and worked for another gentleman, Howard Morrow, here in town, who grew row crop banana squash. One of my many careers, I was a heavy equipment operator, and I've been a antique equipment fan for most of my life, so I am somewhat familiar with a lot of the equipment we'll see today. The Yoder family farmed basically all over southwest Riverside County. So this story started about 2017 when at the annual fire department barbecue, Paul Yoder, son of Charles Yoder, came by our booth and said, "Hey, I've got some photos here on this flash drive. If you'd like to take a look at them, maybe we'll donate them to the Historical Society." So I took a look at the photos, and what I ended up with was about 350 farming photos. Most of our collections that we go through, we'll get a family photo collection. There'll be a lot of the family and that kind of thing, but one or two of the farming operation, where what we got from Paul was a lot of photos. A lot of them I didn't know too much about. So that's Paul on the right, and his dad Charles Yoder on the left. Charles was in his early 90s at this time, so what I did was I would meet with Paul and Charles where Charles was staying, and I would go through the photo files. I numbered all their photos, 1 through whatever it was, and we'd sit down with the photos and the numbers, and I would ask them, "Tell me about this photo." And so they would tell me about it, and I would record it. So I have probably 6 to 8 hours of descriptions in their own words about the family farming operation. This is the one I did last week, was the third one on the Yoder family. I did one at Menifee, and I did one at Temecula, then the last one here in Murrieta. So during the first one up at Menifee, I met David Yoder, Charles's brother. The lady on the left, that's Mary Yoder, that's Uncle David there. His niece, it's Charles's daughter. So I got the opportunity to work in his photo collection also. So I have an extensive collection of Yoder family farming pictures that we'll get to enjoy today. This is Samuel E. Yoder. He was the family patriarch that started everything. He moved from Wooster, Iowa, about 1860, and settled in Hemet in 1893. He died in 1949, and the family farmed 80 acres off Mayberry Street over in Hemet. That was the start of the Yoder family farming dynasty. And in the picture, you can see this picture taken sometime after 1893, that the family was farming with horses. So, pleasure horses and everything in this day and age are one thing, but when you farmed with horses, it was a lot of work. So you see here a 3-hitch with Samuel there, and then to the right another hitch with 3 horses. It looks like they're pulling a harrow of some kind, preparing for planting. On the ranch over on Mayberry and Hemet, they had water, so they grew a lot of alfalfa and things like that. They also had apricots and walnuts and those kind of things. When you farm with horses, they really add to your workday. If you work a horse 8 or 10 hours a day in the field, which was not uncommon, before you had to go out into the field that day, you would have to water the horse, you have to feed the horse, you have to brush the horse, and then you would have to harness the horse and get him out into the field. And at the end of the day, the same thing. So it would add an hour or two each morning, and an hour or two each evening when you got the horses ready before you could go and enjoy your rest of your evening, have your supper, and then probably go to bed and start all over the next day. This 1916 photo, again, they're farming with horses. This is the farm over on Mayberry, in Del Fruta Ranch, they called it, in Hemet, California, in April of 1916. The caption said, "Second crop alfalfa." So here they're cutting their alfalfa crop with a horse-drawn sickle bar mower. The mower was powered by the ground wheel. As the horses pulled it through the field, they would cut it. You can see on the right, irrigation ditch, where the family was fortunate enough to have water. They grew alfalfa and other crops. Another view of the farming operation in those days. The alfalfa's been cut, so to get it out of the field, you would have to hand load it onto wagons, and that particular picture shows the amount of labor involved in stacking your hay onto the wagon to get it to the harvester. This is a hay press or a harvester. Everything on this thing was manual. You had to load the hay in manually, and as it was pressed through the machine, you would have to hand tie the bales. The large wheel right there, I don't know if you can see the cursor or not, that's what powered the harvester. What's not shown is what was powering it. On the left-hand side of the harvester, excuse me, is the belt. So what it doesn't show is what was powering the harvester. So it could have been a steam engine, it could have been an early tractor. It could have also been a horse sweep, which was a mechanism where you'd harness 2 or 4 horses to the sweeps. They would walk into a circle, and then the power through the machine would transmit to belt power. Now, one of Charles's sons, MJ, or Maurice J. Yoder, was probably as tired as his dad as farming with horses. So early on, he experimented with building tractors. This is about 1918, probably 1919. Shows one of the 3 home-built tractors that MJ built. Well advanced for its time. MJ had worked at a foundry, so he had cast the wheels for this particular machine. But what makes it unique is that it is a 4-wheel drive tractor, which was really cutting edge and almost unheard of in this era, especially for a home-built tractor. The caption and the information I got on this particular tractor, it's a 40 horsepower tractor and was capable of pulling a 4-bottom plow. One of the other tractors he's built, again, it looks like about a 40 horsepower tractor, again 4-wheel drive. The family only knew that it was built on a truck frame and was unaware of what type of power plant or anything. Again, he's pulling a plow with it in this particular picture. As you can see in the upper left, that was a number 14 photo that we talked about. A different view of maybe the 3rd tractor shown from the rear pulling a 4-bottom plow, it looks like. So what's interesting about this, the operator's sitting on the sulky seat. There was a trend during this age, late 19 teens and into the early 1920s, where manufacturers would build a tractor that you could control from the sulky seat on your towed implement. Though that way they could use a horse-drawn implement with their tractor. It was controlled by reins, just like you would control a horse. Very cutting edge again for the era. So it was very, like I said, it was very advanced for the day. Again, it looks like a 40 horsepower tractor. By the mid-1920s, this particular photo, 1929, shows what appears to be a Best or Caterpillar 30 crawler type tractor. On the left is a harvester. The family thought that a lot of their early harvesters were Holt manufacturing company. They also built Holt and Best combined to make Caterpillar sometime in this particular time frame. And they're working on a stand of grain there. The same tractor, different location. In the background, you'll see those 3 fellows standing there. Each one of them is operating a Fresno scraper. So while they're working in conjunction with this, they're scraping up dirt, probably filling in washouts or doing some kind of land moving to fill in or make the land more able to be tilled. Again, pretty advanced. If you've never had the pleasure of working a Fresno scraper, can't imagine how much work is involved with this. This is MJ, or Morris J. Yoder, taken about 1935 with one of their TD40 tractors. So Maurice was born in Hemet. Let me see if I can find the date here for you. Born in 1894, he died in 1975. As we go through this photo collection, MJ was the fellow that took most of the photos. He also donated land for a college and owned a furniture store up in Riverside. So by the mid-1930s, they'd moved to these diesel-powered McCormick Deering International track-type tractors, and they were diesel-powered. And it added greatly to their productivity and their ability to farm greater and greater acreage. MJ's family, MJ in the center there on the right lower, his wife Anita, and left to right on the boys is David, Joseph, and in the top there is Charles, and to the right the two women, Medina and Evelyn. So after the family farmed off of Mayberry there in Hemet, they later moved their operation over to Paris. And during this time they transitioned, after the death of Samuel Lee, they took out a lot of the orchards and started planting grain. And from that time on, for the most part, they were dryland grain farmers. And what that meant was they planted large acreages of grain, oats, and wheat mainly, and you don't irrigate those dryland farms, so it depends on the rain to make a successful crop. Up until this year, probably wouldn't have been a very good year for dryland farming because there wasn't a lot of rain. This year it's hard to say. If they planted early, it would probably be a good year. If they had to wait later in the year to plant, the fields would be so wet you might not be able to plant them. Again, this is Paris. This was on Watson and Murrieta Road. They had 5 sections of land there. During this time, they were also farming 2 sections, 1,280 acres, in the bottom of what is now Lake Paris. Another view, typical farmstead of the time, buildings, grain storage, equipment yard, and those kind of things. Looks like it has snowed that year. Early on, MJ had made a deal with Malin Vale, who owned the Vale Cattle Company down in the Temecula, greater Temecula area. And he began farming with cooperation with the Vale Cattle Company in the Long Valley area down there. There was a lot of acreage down there. Never really got an accurate count on how many acres they had down there. It was all dry land. It was hilly and rolling and kind of rocky. So the buildings in the foreground, this was called the Yoder camp. The barn is still there today. They farmed it up until 1966, sometime I believe they started sometime in the early 1920s down there. And so those of you familiar with the area, the dirt road to the right there, that is Rancho California Road. Maurice Winery is now currently at this location. And when you dry farm, it's a 2-year cycle. So you would farm, you would plant 1 year, harvest, and then it would go fallow for the following year, and then they would replant the next year. Long Valley had so much property that they would run a 3-year cycle. They would plant it, it would go fallow for 2 years, and during those 2 years, the second year they probably got a pretty good volunteer crop of whatever oats or wheat. And the Vale Cattle Company would run their cattle on it for grazing. And part of the payment that the deal they had with Malin Vale was that Malin Vale took payment for use of the land in grain. The Vale Cattle Company had a feedlot down in Temecula on Lower Highway 79 that they would fatten their cattle for market, so they would use the grain that they got in return for use of the land. They also bought heavily into Murrieta. For those of you not familiar, the road in the foreground, that's Murrieta Hot Springs Road. Into the right would be the 215 freeway. So this was a winery, bought early. The winery was built. The crops and the wine, or the vineyard there, didn't grow very well because anytime they drilled a well there, they hit mineralized hot water. It's part of the Hot Springs, Warner Springs, Temescal Canyon Hot Springs fault. So they didn't grow any grain. MJ bought it, and they used this building for equipment storage and farmed the land all around it. This was MJ's house. It sat up on the hill behind the winery, about where Sam's Club is today. This is Charles's house in Murrieta. They moved into Murrieta about 1949. I built a house up on a hill there, right off Los Alamos Road. Murrieta Mesa High School currently sits on this piece of property. After Charles sold out, it was bought by a man named John McElroy, and then later on the Murrieta Valley Unified School District acquired it and built the high school there. This photo taken down at the Paris Ranch shows one of the TD-40s pulling a wheatland plow. So this is a 10-foot swath plow. Unlike a lot of places in the east where they used a moldboard plow, a plow that as you pulled it, it turned the ground over. Out here in the west, they used these wheatland plows. Basically, they were a disc plow. They had big discs, and they were angled, and they turned the dirt, the soil over pretty much in the same way. They worked really good in the west out here, especially where the land was rocky. And this particular photo, again, shows a TD-40. Looking at the foreground there, this land had never been planted before, so they were breaking this ground, preparing it for a crop. You can see kind of sagebrushy, and looks like somebody was running cattle on it ahead of time, looking at the bones left over. Kind of see this picture repeated again, 1935. This shows three of the TD-40s, and each of them pulling a 10-foot plow, wheatland plow. So they're covering about 30 foot every time they make a pass through the field. You'll see this kind of repeated again and again as they use these frequently in this kind of a squadron configuration. The previous picture, like this one, were probably taken at the Paris Ranch. So as the horsepower on the tractors, a TD-40 means it was a tracked diesel 40 horsepower tractor, a lot more power than a wheel tractor. So they took advantage of a lot of the equipment they had. So in the center there with the wheels, they have made basically a carrier hooked to the tractor, and they've hooked a series of probably 4 10-foot harrows to it. So they could take advantage of the horsepower of the tractor and cover 40 feet at a pass, actually. Another TD-40, another wheatland plow. This gives you an idea. This is Long Valley out east of Temecula. You can get an idea of the type of terrain out there. It was hilly and rolling and that kind of stuff. So people that farmed this kind of land relied extensively on track-type tractors. Starting in the mid-1940s, they stepped up their game. After the war, these Caterpillar D8 tractors became available. So roughly 3 times the size of the TD-40s. They were anywhere from 100 to 110 horsepower tractor that weighed in the neighborhood of 80,000 pounds. Diesel. And one of the other things that happened here in the very center there where the guy's sitting, you can see that bar coming up. This is called a quadrant shift tractor. So it had a manual transmission and a manual clutch. Direct drive is what they call it. So every time they wanted to change directions, they had to wrestle that transmission out of whatever, say, third gear back into reverse. The next generation of these tractors, as Caterpillar built them, they put what they called a forward and reverse, or a shuttle in them. So instead of shifting the main transmission, it had a forward and reverse gear, a selector. You push it forward, pull it back for the forward reverse selection. And so it made it really easy to forward and reverse the tractor instead of constantly shifting the main transmission. Now, this was a big plus for the construction industry. So if you were running a construction outfit, if you're pushing using a bulldozer to push dirt, you spend about as much time going backwards as you do forward, so it saved them a lot of time. But in a farming operation, because most of the time they're going forward, it didn't really slow them down. So as the contractors turned these in for the newer models, the Yoder family took advantage of that, and at one time they had as many as 8 of these D8 tractors. To the back is a subsoiler. Basically, you call it a subsoiler in a farming operation, or it's a ripper if you're doing construction work. Basically, it has 3 long shanks that go down about 3.5 to 4 feet in the ground, and as you pull it along, it breaks up the hard pan underneath the line that's formed when you pull a wheatland or a disc over it all the time. Below the disc or plow line, it forms a hard pan. And so the water doesn't percolate and it doesn't hold moisture, so they would use this subsoiler basically to break up that hard pan. This picture was taken in 1949. So the Yoder family had bought so many Caterpillar equipment, they got a page in the Caterpillar magazine. So on the left is David Yoder, and in the center with the hat, that's Joseph Yoder, his older brother. So the article talks about the Yoder family farming operation, how they depend on these D8 Caterpillars, and also notes that Joseph had a D6. The Yoder family had a lot of equipment. This is a different one. This is actually a International McCormick Deering. This is a TD18. So they used other equipment besides Caterpillar. Charles Yoder was particularly fond of McCormick Deering equipment as opposed to Caterpillar equipment because of the way they started. The McCormick Deering, or the TD18 here, started on gasoline with a regular battery start, and then switched over to diesel, where the Caterpillar, the big Caterpillars, they had a 2-cylinder gasoline engine mounted on the side that you would have to start and then use the clutch mechanism on the pony motor, they called it, to start the main engine. So sometimes those pony motors were bulky and they started hard, and the International one was a little bit of easier start. Only thing you had to remember at the end of the day, you had to switch it back to gasoline. This was the picture shows pretty much the backbone of the family farming operation through the 1940s. All the way up until the family got out of the farming business in the late 1960s. The harvester, that's a Model 36 John Deere, again with a Caterpillar D8. What's not shown, these John Deere harvesters early on had a tiller wheel mounted on the tongue of the harvester that helped bear the weight of the harvester and helped it steer a little bit. So because of the rocky terrain that they were farming, especially mainly in Murrieta and Long Valley, when they got to these bigger crawler tractors, they took that wheel off and mounted it directly to the drawbar on the D8 because it could handle the weight. So again, a harvester, it cuts the grain and it separates the grain from the chaff, stores it in a bin, and then the auger comes off to the right there. Once the bin is full, it could be augered off into the grain truck and taken into the yard. Harvesters, grain farming, pretty labor intensive. Depending on what type of harvester you had, you needed a tractor operator and at least one man on the harvester to tend the header. A few pictures we'll see a little bit later. I'll explain a little bit more about the header. And if you were sacking the grain instead of augering it or bin storing it for bulk storage, you had a guy that would sack the grain. So sometimes you need 3 people. Another picture taken in Paris shows a D8, and where the TD40 would pull one 10-foot wheatland, the D8 would pull 4. So they would take those wheatlands, they would build up a hitch for them, and they'd put 3 of them together, and they'd cover about a 30-foot pass instead of a 10-foot pass with a smaller tractor. This picture taken in Long Valley, it shows a D8, shows a series of harrows or spring teeth. The land's been probably fallow, but it's ready to plant. So the spring tooth or their shovel sweeps would break the ground up, and in the back you can see at least 3 10-foot grain drills. So they would break the ground, and then they would plant it all in the same pass, thanks to the horsepower they were using. In the right rear there, that truck, the Yoder family also took advantage of a lot of the surplus that was available out of after World War II. And they bought a lot of trucks, and probably some of their tractors were purchased at the same time. Long Valley, a different view. This is M.J. Yoder's outfit. This is three Wheatlands hooked together being pulled by a D8. The caption says it's 42 28-inch blades, 2.8 miles per hour in third gear. This was a 48-49 picture, again, taken in Long Valley. Gives you an idea of how much ground they were able to cover once they went to the bigger tractors. Now, the farm shops built these and added, basically hooked what was originally a 10-foot Wheatland together with the rest of them. So the farm shops, as you'll see in a few more pictures, were very innovative about building things and repairing things and maintaining things to meet their needs. This particular picture shows the hitch on that tractor. So at the top there, you can see where it would hook to the drawbar, and the cables were used to control the spread and angle of the Wheatland plows they were pulling. Now, on these early tractors had basically no power transfer, maybe a flat belt pulley. In this particular area, everything was run off cables. So the tractor would have a cable drum on it, and you would thread the cable out. And as you can see, they had a couple of snatch blocks and a bunch of different directions they were pulling, used to control the Wheatland plow they were pulling. Later on, we'll see some other equipment that is controlled by cables. Once the hydraulic systems became a little bit more advanced, then they moved to hydraulic systems. Long Valley, probably in the early 1960s, shows the scope of their farming, their harvesting operation. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 Model 36 harvesters, and of course 5 D8 Caterpillars. And on the right, it's a self-propelled. It was I think it was a John Deere Model 59. It was the first self-propelled harvester the Yoders purchased. Basically, what it did with one person operating in one pass, it would basically do everything what the Caterpillar and the Model 36 would do, but it would do it with one operator without all of the other needed stuff. This is the front of it in Model 36. Again, you can see it. The projection off to the right, that's the grain auger that they would use to auger the grain off of the harvester into the waiting grain trucks. Later on they had an international. This is a little bit of a bigger harvester. It gives you a view. The paddles in the front are the what's called the header, and basically it rotates in a circle, pulls the grain in. At the bottom there's a sickle bar cutter, cuts the grain. It then conveyored up into the harvester, which separates the grain from the chaff, the stuff they don't want. The chaff goes out the back of the harvester, and the grain goes into the hopper to be offloaded and taken for storage. This one was taken in August 1966. This is Yoder Camp, and this is when the grain came in out of the fields. It was real common to basically, if you didn't have tanks or other ways to store it, or you didn't sack it for seed grain, you would just auger it out on the ground, and then later on, when it was sold, they would auger it into the truck and it would go to the mill. The local mill was probably in San Bernardino, or it went up to LA. Like Hemet and the Lakeview property, the 1280 at Lakeview, Lake Paris, and the Paris Ranch, they did have water and they had wells. And so this is a typical well of the area. The well was drilled, and because they didn't have electricity, they used a belt-powered pump. So you see the the belt goes between the wellhead and to the back of a tractor. I think that's one of their, I think it's their D6. So the tractor would power the pump, just like you saw on the early harvester or the early hay press. They would use a flat belt to power this. A typical irrigation ditch, they would dig these ditches and then they would run these laterals off of them out into the fields. There was a fellow named, last name was Sharp, that actually sublet some of the Paris Ranch and grew potatoes there. Potatoes were big there in Paris and then over toward Lakeview and Nuevo. At Paris, where they had water, they also irrigated alfalfa. This picture, about 1949, shows a truck, and I think that was MJ's 49 Ford back there. The thing mounted on the left side of the truck there is a hay elevator. So as they drove through the field, that would pick the bales up and elevate them up so you could stack them on the truck. So a labor-saving device where you just drive through and it would bring them up to the truck level and you could just stack them, as opposed to bucking, which means you pick them off the ground and have to load them onto the truck that way, which was a very labor-intensive process. Well, when you're scattered out all over southwest Riverside County and farming in a lot of locations, you have to move your equipment. So on the right there, that's probably a 2.5 or a 5-ton ex-military truck, a trailer, and one of the D8 Caterpillars on it. That's, you know, you're looking at 80 to 90,000 pounds worth of equipment there. As I mentioned earlier, when the Yoder family had a need for something they couldn't buy or didn't want to buy, they would actually make it in the farm shops. And they made this trailer and used it for many, many years to move their equipment all over to their different locations where they were farming. So when you had a piece of equipment you couldn't load or you couldn't pull down the road, they used this device called the chain carryall. This particular one is slinging their Southwest Ripper. You can see the 3 ripper shanks hanging down, subsoiler. So you would back this chain carryall over the implement you need to pick up, hook the chains up, and you use winches, and you would basically lift it up off the ground so that you could transport it to wherever you needed it. This shows MJ's approximately 40-foot Wheatland plow combination. So what they've done, they've picked it up with the chain carryall and hooked part of it to the back of their 6x6 boom truck. So that was just another labor-intensive project to move their equipment where they needed it. Excuse me. So when you see the harvesters, especially the Model 36, they have, you know, 10 or 15 foot of header sticking off. So if they needed to move that particular harvester, they actually removed the header off of the harvester and carried it like this. The harvester they could probably tow down the road, but the header, because it was so big and didn't have wheels on it, they would have to sling load it on a chain carryall and then move it to the location where they put it all back together so they could use it. This is the Charles Yoder family. On the upper left is Sharon, in the middle is Mrs. Yoder, to the right is Paul, on the bottom left is Mary Yoder, then David, and on the right is Sam. Again, they lived, house built up about 1950 up on Los Alamos Road in Murrieta here. This is Charles. Charles was an avid flyer, owned many planes over his lifetime. This was taken across Los Alamos Road from the family house near Yoder Wash, where they ultimately ended up building an airfield. Charles was a, excuse me, a founding member of the Murrieta Flying Club, was on the school board, very active civically, and was an honorary member of the Murrieta Volunteer Fire Department because he would respond out with the Yoder family water truck to assist them with fires. Hopefully you can see this. It's a picture of aerial view of Murrieta. To the right there, going straight up, that is Highway 215, and to the left is the 15 freeway. At the bottom is Murrieta Hot Springs Road. The red line shows the Yoder family farming operation in Murrieta. So basically, the Yoder's farm, which is now pretty much the whole center of the city of Murrieta. To the very right there is the Murrieta Hot Springs. You can see where their house is, and their airstrip and some of the other stuff that they had there. We'll move on to Murrieta. This is taken about 1935, shows a squadron of the TD-40s, early photo, breaking ground out in the Murrieta area right after they acquired all the land in Murrieta. So there's 3 of them. They're each pulling a 10-foot wheatland. As you can see, it's hilly and probably very rocky out there. Another view down in the valley there. This whole area shown in this picture and the previous is all covered by houses now. This is an early harvesting operation, probably about 1935. The family wasn't sure whether these were Holt or early John Deere harvesters. So a very informative picture. You can see the hogbacks that are Murrieta landmark on the upper left there. So the header is the pieces to the left. You can see where it's connected to the harvester. The guy in the hat there holding the big wheel, he's the header tender. So he controls the height of the header as it cuts the grain. So if you get it down too low, you pick up too much chaff and it kind of slows your harvester down. Basically, a harvester cuts the grain and separates the grain from the chaff. So if it's too high, you get it too high, you start leaving grain behind, which isn't a good thing. So in this particular photo shows the tractor operator and 2 people on the harvester. Different view shows the big round wheel is the one that the header tender uses, the tractor operator. The third person on this harvester is the bagger. So these harvesters didn't have the ability to store the grain on a bin so that it could be bulk handled. So the third man actually sewed the grain as it came off out of the separator on the harvester, sewed it into sacks, and that piece hanging down to the lower right there by the wheel, that's just a chute. When the bag was full, he sewed it shut and then dropped it in that chute, and it slid down on the ground, and then later they would come by with a truck and pick the bags up. The long exhaust pipes were an attempt to stop sparks that come out of the exhaust from setting your grain field on fire. So to harvest grain, it has to be ripe, of course, and it has to be dry. So they harvested in most times in late spring, early summer, if it was a wet winter, more into the summer. So the grain was cured, and so if you threw a spark out into it, it would readily catch fire. And with the wind in Murrieta, it would spread very rapidly. So you would lose a lot of your crop, which was your main source of income. Murrieta, this is, I believe this is a D6. It's pulling the Southwest Ripper. They're doing some subsoiling work, breaking the ground up either to plant or maybe move a little bit of the dirt around to fill in some washouts. In the background where those trees are, that's the Murrieta Hot Springs, Gunther's Murrieta Hot Springs. Gives you an idea of the location. This is Alta Murrieta nowadays. Later on, Charles upped his game also and built his own large wheatland gang. This was taken out a little bit east of the family home there off Los Alamos Road. Shows his wheatland setup. Again, these things, they built these things themselves. They take a 10-foot wheatland and they put it all together and so they could take advantage. This particular tractor is an international TD-24. This was kind of Charles's famous favorite tractor. Used it extensively on his ranch, on this farm here in Murrieta. As you can see, it's doing some hillside work, pulling basically a 40-foot swath. So we talked about hills and talked about rocky terrain. This picture, 1966, it was taken here in Murrieta. Gives you an idea of the type of terrain they were operating in. As you can see on the right, the header is working on the uphill side, and what you notice is the harvester's level on the side of the hill. For a separator, the separator part of the harvester to work right, it had to be level. So these harvesters had the ability to crank up the land wheel, the downhill wheel, to keep the separator level. If your separator wasn't level, everything would go to the downhill side and pretty much choke up the works. and then it'd plug up and you'd have to get in there and pull it all out. Looking at the tractor, I think it's their TD18s pulling it there. As I mentioned, Long Valley and Murrieta were hilly and they were rocky. So when you have hills, you get washouts, which are rough on your equipment and actually have the potential to stick your harvester or your tractor. So the Yoder family, once they were faced with this problem, basically built skids under all their tractors. Not their tractors, excuse me, under their harvesters, where when the wheel fell in the ditch, it would land on the skids and they could basically drag it out. So at the end of this video, I'll be able to show you some video of some harvesting operations. You'll see how this actually works. Most of the photos that we see today and in their extensive collection, and the video, the family credited to MJ took most of these. A little farther view, this is probably out about where the Catholic Church is out there and off of Whitewood Avenue. Shows Charles's wheatland set up and he's pulling 4 seed drills. Again, you get an idea of some of the washouts they would have to deal with. This is taken at the Yoder family compound down across Los Alamos from their house. Gives you an idea of how Charles designed this wheatland plow to contour follow. And you'll notice, unlike MJ's wheatland that was controlled by cables, this particular tractor, or being a newer one, has the hydraulic. That's all those hoses coming off the back, and that gave him the ability to raise and lower and change the angle on the wheatland plow. Great advantage they had. And in the rear is, you can barely see the back end of one of the Model 36 harvesters. I mentioned before, Charles was a founding member of the Murrieta Flying Club, and when they decided they needed an airfield, they did what most of the people in Murrieta did at the time. They built their own airfield. So in conjunction with their farming operation, they also had a lot of earth moving equipment. So what you see here in the center, that's a Laterne scraper being pulled by a D8. It's probably capable of picking up 12 to 15 yards of dirt, and then it would transport it to where you needed the dirt and it would eject it out on the ground. In the rear there's looks like one of the D6s with a bulldozer blade on it. So in Paris and Lakeview, over at Lake Paris, where they had the ability to irrigate. When you irrigate land with ditches and stuff like that, the land has to have a certain amount of fall or gradient in it so the water will flow. It can't be perfectly flat, and it can't be full of potholes that just fill up with water and don't do anything. So this particular piece of equipment behind this D8 is called a land plane. So it basically was a big scraper bowl controlled by the operator, and it would pick up dirt and it would use it to fill low spots and basically change the grade. You know, these guys were capable of cutting a grade that might be a half an inch to an inch, you know, every 200 feet or 100 feet, so that when you plowed your ditches in for your irrigation, the water would flow in the right direction at the right speed. Nowadays, all this is all controlled by lasers, so the operator just drives around making the passes, and the laser system controls all of this. In this particular days, the operators did it, and it was, having done this kind of work, it's pretty amazing the skills that these operators had. Another piece of the Yoder earth moving equipment, this is a La Platte scraper. This is also cable like the Laternes. They're controlled by the cable drum at the rear of the D8. So they had probably 4 Laterne in this La Platte that they used extensively for their grading and soil conservation efforts. This is an example of one of their soil conservation efforts, 1961. This is on the Yoder property. The tree line in the background is Warm Springs Creek. So the family tells me they had a bunch of hills, a bunch of washouts, and they couldn't farm it. So they hauled all their equipment out there and basically filled it in and made the land tillable. So at the very top back there is a ripper or a subsoiler. The next tractor on the left up there is pulling a bowl scraper. The bottom tractor there is pulling the Southwest ripper. The one there in the center is has one of the Laterne scrapers hooked to it, and then on the right is one that has a bulldozer attachment on it. So they would go out, and if they needed to fix something, they were more than capable. The Yoder family had enough rolling stock, enough equipment of this type that if they decided to get out of the farming business, they could open their own construction company. They had enough of dirt moving equipment and expertise that they could actually compete with any of the road building contractors of the day. This kind of winds down our presentation. If you'll bear with me here in a minute, I will start a video for you. I like to end with this picture. It's just a picture of them disking under some stubble, but I'm always amazed at how straight a line they could pull with this early equipment. Again, you can see the cable operating to open and close the gang. So if you worked for one of these families that did this kind of work, you had to be a pretty good operator yourself, because if you couldn't, plow or disc out the corners or keep your furrows straight or keep your disc line straight, you usually didn't end up working for them very long, because they maximized every square foot. They didn't like a lot of overlap, and they didn't like you wasting a lot of time because it cost them a lot of money. So if you bear with me, I'll shut this down. I'll start this video, and I'll do a little bit of narrative with it as we go along. If I can get out of this thing. So MJ took a lot of these photos, and what you're seeing here, this is a harvesting operation on the Paris Ranch. So this particular Model 36 harvester is being pulled by the D6 Caterpillar, I believe. So this gives you an idea of what it entails. So you'll see the paddles, they're cutting and they're picking up the grain. It gets cut and then it gets transferred on to the harvester where the grain is separated. There's no sound with this video, but what it doesn't explain is how hot and itchy and dusty these type of operations are. Always in the summer, spring, if you had a following wind, you were going to get coated with chaff and itch, and it was not a real pleasant job. Barely in the center there, you can see the grain being elevated up. The operator up there on the harvester, he's tending the header to make sure it stays nice and level. You can see it going up the chute into the tractor, or into the harvester rather. So once the harvester's grain bin is full, it pulls up next to one of the grain trucks, and this is augered out of the harvester into the grain truck. And that's grain right out of the field. It's been cut and separated from the chaff, and it's ready to go into storage or to market. So this is one of the grain storage bins at the Paris Ranch. Lower right there, the grain truck is dumping the grain out. It's coming out that chute and going into a hopper, and the belt moving to the left, it's a bucket elevator. It picks the grain up, takes it up, and dumps it into the top of the grain bin. So as you look at all this stuff, and we'll see some harvesters here in a second, not only were the days long and hot and dusty, all this equipment had to be maintained. So it had to be greased, it had to be repaired, all the rolling stock had to have the oil and fluids changed, and so that was what you did in your downtime if you had any, or if you just had to keep the stuff rolling. This is Murrieta. It shows a hillside operation. I believe this is the TD18 with a Model 36 harvester. You can see the harvester's level, the tractor's not quite level. It shows a little bit better in some of the other photos. So if you watch that thing bouncing off to the left and the rear there, that's the counterbalance for the header. So the header tender guy doesn't, he's not lifting all that weight himself. That's a counterweight. And you can see the chaff blowing out the back, and like I mentioned, if you had a following wind, all that stuff ends up in your lap up on the harvester. It's a really good view of a hillside operation. You can tell by the angle of the tractor it's a pretty good side hill. Again, a good view of the header and everything. Whoop! See, they just fell in a hole there, so you had to pick the header up, keep it out of the dirt. Good view of the counterbalance in the back. And as the chaff comes out the back, there's a spreader there that spreads it out and it gets tilled back in for next year. So again, he's going to drop into a hole. Not too bad. There's the footage I mentioned earlier about going through a big ditch. You can see all the moving stuff that had to be maintained. See, it dropped into the hole. They're just going to pull it right out. So the grain truck's waiting up on the top. So overall, the family had 80 acres in Hemet that they later sold. They had two sections, 2,720 acres in Paris, 1,280 in Lakeview. Don't know how much in Murrieta or there, but overall, at the peak of their farming operation, they were farming over 13,000 acres. So they had at one time at least 8 of the TD40s. They had a TD14, a TD18, and a TD24. Later on, Charles had a TD25. Probably had 7 or 8 D8 Caterpillars, a D6, and some other various tractors. Mainly grew oats and wheat, some row crops, alfalfa and stuff over in Paris and Lakeview. So this particular operation, they are loading the grain onto a different truck. It's coming out of the grain storage bin, and there again you can see the guy that gets to shovel the grain out to the corners. And once his trucks are loaded, they're tarped, and then they're off to the market. This particular elevator is called a paddle. Instead of having buckets, it has these paddles that elevate the grain. Like I mentioned before, the market for the grain was either San Bernardino or maybe even as far as Los Angeles. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I wish we had a live audience. It's always more interesting when you can have some feedback and some questions and answers. So be sure to check us out, Murrieta Museum or Murrieta Valley Historical Society, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.